Yeah, so hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. And thank you, Demos, the Democracy, Migration and Society Research Group, for allowing us to organize such event. Yeah, and for being very supportive. Thank you, Oscar and Martin. So today is the 60 days of the war on Gaza, of the ongoing genocide that we are witnessing from here with impunity. At least 16,000 Palestinians have been killed, and more than 42,000 others are injured. Yeah, so today we want to talk about the political economy of the arms industry of Israel with Dr. Shir. And before this, I think in a way we are also participating in dehumanizing Palestinian when we keep talking about numbers without thinking of them as human and as people like us dying who have dreams and ambitions and families. And so I would like you, before we start the talk today, to take maybe 1 minute and think of them or pray for them, or you can switch off your camera, or you can light a candle. Do it in your way. Pray or think in your way. Just have 1 minute of silence for them, if this is okay with everyone. Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. So today we have Dr. Shir Hever. He's an economist researching the economic impact of Israeli occupation of Palestine. He is also the author of Political Economy of Israeli Occupation and the Privatization of Israeli Security. He's also the military embargo coordinator of the Palestinian BDS National Committee. So we will start with your talk. So the floor is yours, and then we will follow with Leandros Fisher, my colleague, with some question, and then we will open the floor for the audience to ask questions. And please feel free to post your question in the chat. Sophie will be, oh, what is this? Nothing. The balloons, my God. I don't know from where they come, but anyway. Yeah, so please write your question in the chat, and Sophie will take care of them. Yeah, Shir.
Thank you, Amira, and thank you everyone for coming. So maybe I'll just briefly start with a word about myself. My name is Shir Hever, and I was born in and grew up in Jerusalem. I'm in a Jewish family, and I live in Germany now. I'm not an Israeli citizen anymore, but my activism about Palestine is mixed also with my academic work on Palestine and my career in working on Palestine. So it's all together. And today we have an event which is part of a university event, so an academic event. The topic, the political economy of the military industry in Israel, or the security industry in Israel, is something that I've given a lot of talks about before. It's very connected to the topic of my second book, The Privatization of Security in Israel. But I think that in light of the current situation, I doubt that there is a lot of interest here to go into a very academic, dry analysis, to go from the whole history and all that stuff. Of course, I'm always very happy to connect with you also on an individual level. If you're looking for materials, if you want to read about how the Israeli military industry started, actually it started in the year 1933, so 90 years ago. And so we have a lot of space to cover in those 90 years. So I think I will not give too much time to this now, focusing more on the urgent and developing situation on the ground, especially in the Gaza Strip, not only in the Gaza Strip, and the role of the Israeli military industry. But I also have to apologize from the beginning because from the get-go, because I'm not really at my best these days, as this is these are events that have affected me also on a very personal level, and I've lost friends in Israel in the attack of October 7, and I've lost many friends in Gaza and also in the West Bank, and this is really a very difficult time, and therefore it's a little bit difficult also to concentrate and to speak coherently. Please stop me or interrupt me in a way if I'm stop making sense, and help me get back on track on our topic. And I think that this is also important to say that it's not only about the shock and the sadness of what is happening, but also the silencing. And we had a minute of silence for the people who have been killed. And I'm thinking about an Israeli journalist, Israel Frey, who is an ultra-Orthodox Jew, who said the prayer, the Jewish prayer of Kaddish for the deceased. It's what it's for the soul of dead people. And he said Kaddish both for the Israelis and the Palestinians who are killed. And as a response to this, right-wing activists in Israel have published his private address, and an angry mob came to murder his entire family. Because if he also recognizes Palestinians as human beings, then he's a traitor. And he had to escape with his family, and he still cannot go back home. This is also a very difficult moment, and of course I'm very privileged that I can speak to you from Germany, where I still have the freedom to speak, although the freedom of speech in Germany about Palestine is also something very much questionable these days. Not our topic for today. Let me get now into the topic of the political economy of the Israeli military industry. If I really rush through the history very quickly, I think it's interesting to see how the industry has developed from more ideological, state-owned industry that is supposed to provide the tools for the Israeli military in order to conduct its operations. For example, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948, the Nakba, but also for all the wars. But over time, there was a deep change in the way that the Israeli military industry operates. What are the goals? What is the structure? There's a very good book by Yaakov Lifshitz, who was former manager of the Israeli Minister of Finance, who explained that the changes in the Israeli military industry were a result of external factors. So there was a process from a very ideological, state-owned industry, which arms you could even say arms the Zionist movement more than arms the state of Israel, really and sometimes also sells weapons, but not for profit, sells weapons in order to make money, to do more research, to develop stronger weapons. So again, the idea is not a capitalist idea. But today we see a completely different situation. And according to Yaakov Lifshitz, who I think his research is very good, but politically, of course, he's a strong supporter of the state of Israel and its and a justifier of the crimes that it commits. Nevertheless, we should read good scholarship, even if we don't agree with the politics of the authors. He argues that maybe the main shifting point was the end of the Cold War, because by aligning with the United States, Israel has already made it very difficult to have a military industry which is not capitalist in nature. The US didn't like that. And from 1973, when the US started to give military financing to the Israeli military, I assume that you know about this, that there is no country in the world that receives more military financing than Israel. But this military financing is often misunderstood, as if the US is giving money to Israel. That's not true. The US is giving free weapons, free US weapons. And part of the way that the US uses this mechanism is to prevent the Israeli arms industry from competing with it, from developing weapons which are also developed by the big US companies, Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, these giants. Each one of them is bigger than the entire Israeli military industry combined. And each one of them is very concerned if Israel will start to sell drones or missiles that cheaper than what the US is already selling and compete with them. So whenever an Israeli company wants to develop something, the big US companies pressure the Pentagon. Why don't we give the Israeli government this particular weapon for free? And so the Israeli government says, then we don't need to buy it from our own military companies, and the military companies have to change. So over the years, the Israeli military industry developed a kind of synergy with the US military industry to develop weapons that are complementary, or systems that are complementary with the US systems. So for example, you all know the F-16 fighter plane, which is a very strong product for the US military industry, made by Lockheed Martin. And the Israeli largest arms company, Elbit Systems, is producing helmets for the pilots of that airplane, right? So you can see how this is a kind of synergy, complementary products, as they say in economics, where if you have the plane, you also want the helmet. If you don't have the plane, you have no reason to buy the helmet. So there is no worry about competition. But with the end of the Cold War, the Israeli industry came into crisis. And this is exactly the crisis that Yaakov Lifshitz is describing in his book. Because suddenly the demand for weapons goes down, the West has not entirely demilitarized, but reduced military expenditures a lot. And Israel is not allowed to sell weapons to countries that are aligned with the enemies, or so-called enemies, of the United States. Most importantly, China. So Israel is not allowed by the US to sell weapons to China. And so the Israeli companies had to adapt. And this is where we get into a new era in the Israeli military industry, which is often called the laboratory era, meaning that weapons are developed for oppression, not for war. And in fact, the flagship weapons that the Israeli companies are making, the most well-known systems, we're talking about the separation wall in the West Bank with all of the security cameras and the biometric surveillance technology. We're talking about drones. We're talking about incarceration technology to control prisoners. We're talking about facial recognition technology, riot gear. All of these things are not things that are intended to be used in actual war. They're intended to use against civilians. And so also the customers of Israeli weapons has changed and became mostly oppressive authoritarian regimes which want these kinds of weapons for their own purposes. So this has already started during the last 2 decades of the apartheid regime in South Africa, where Israel became a major supplier to the apartheid government in South Africa because they needed this kind of oppression technology to prevent the population from rising up. As I'm sure you know, it didn't work. The technology was not strong enough to prevent people from rising up and establishing a democracy. But there are many other cases. After September 11 in 2001, the US established the Department of Homeland Security, which became a very important customer to this particular kind of technology of incarceration, surveillance, and control of a civilian population. And Israeli companies flourished from that. And then we started to hear, especially from, let's say, leftist activists, from people who are in solidarity with Palestine, that Israel is using the occupation as a laboratory and testing its weapons on Palestinians. There is a very heated debate about this, because the argument that Israel is using the occupation as a laboratory is not just coming from voices who are in solidarity with Palestine. It also comes from the Israeli companies themselves. They say, yes, we are doing scientific work in developing the most efficient and powerful weapons by testing them in what they call battlefield conditions, but there is no battlefield. It's a military against civilians. It's what we call asymmetrical conflict. But nevertheless, in arms fairs around the world, they are highlighting this technology. And then we have to ask ourselves also the question, if we talk about the laboratory model, are we actually inadvertently doing some kind of advertisement for the Israeli arms companies? I don't think that the response to this should be that we should censor ourselves, not discuss about it, but we should be aware of this dilemma. We should be aware of this complexity. So we're talking about Israel becoming a sort of trademark for the world oppression industry. And if we talk about the size of the Israeli military exports, compared to other countries, Israel is not the biggest arms exporter in the world. Don't make that mistake. The biggest arms exporter in the world is the United States, and after that there is Russia, Great Britain, Germany, France. Sweden actually sells more weapons than Israel, and Israel hovers at around number 7 to number 10, depending on which year, as the biggest exporter, which is still quite a lot considering the size of the country. And in terms of per capita exports, Israel is the number 1. It sells more weapons per capita than any other country in the world. But there are other sectors in Israel which are not the military sector as well. So within this sector of military exports, there are some products which are very much highlighted as Israeli products because they are associated with the brand of Israel. And no product is more associated closely with the Israeli brand than spyware. I don't know if you know what spyware is, but you may have heard about Pegasus and Predator, these famous spyware companies, which take control of devices, phones, but also computers remotely, and allows an operator to enter your phone and not only download all of your information, read everything you have on your phone, look into your conversations, it can also they can also write into your phone. They can post something on social media that looks like you posted it, and thereby making you commit a crime or spread misinformation without knowing it. This is why spyware is such a dangerous technology. And Israel did not invent spyware. There are governments who already have access to spyware, like the United States, of course, Russia. But Israel is the only country in the world which allows private companies to sell spyware for profit. And when that scandal was exposed, shortly after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the Washington Post journalist who was tracked by an Israeli spyware program by Pegasus and then assassinated by the Saudi government. The Israeli companies responded. The Israeli spyware companies said, "Oh, but we only sell according to the instructions of the Israeli Ministry of Defense. We don't sell to anyone. We only sell to governments that the Israeli government allows us to sell." So they do have the authorization to sell for profit, but not to everyone. And this, of course, created the incentive to research a little bit. So who are they selling to? Who are the big customers of Israeli spyware? And Saudi Arabia is, of course, one of them. But there is a very interesting research. I could share the link if you want later, that shows that the path of diplomatic efforts by Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu in the globe, the countries that he visited and signed various agreements with, corresponds not just to the list of countries that bought Israeli spyware, but also corresponds to the dates in which agreements were signed in those countries. So this is what Roshana Dadu, the scholar who wrote this, she's actually from South Africa, called spyware diplomacy. Spyware diplomacy, because the efforts of the Israeli government are to find specific countries that need spyware and to provide them with that technology in exchange for diplomatic support, not just for money. And the countries that are on this list are the most authoritarian repressive regimes. Now, there have been a lot of protests about this. How can Israel provide deadly weapons and spyware to governments which are committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, to Myanmar, for example, which is using Israeli weapons against the Rohingya minority? And I think it's surprising, horrifying, disappointing to see that a lot of these people who have promoted those campaigns and said, how can we allow Israel to sell weapons to countries that commit those terrible atrocities, when the Israeli government itself is committing those atrocities, they have gone silent. There are specific people that I think of that are failing to say that the level of atrocities that are committed by the Myanmar government against Rohingya or by the Bolsonaro administration in Brazil or by the Orban administration in Hungary and so on are somehow worse or worthy of mentioning. But when the Israeli government is using those same weapons by the same companies but against Palestinians, suddenly there is no discussion about this because maybe it's self-defense, maybe then it's justified. So this really brings me now to talk about what's happening right now. And I think that, first of all, there was a moment where I have to acknowledge that my own research efforts, I feel that they have failed to a large extent, because over the last decade, more or less, I have developed a theory that because the Israeli repression of Palestinians is not successful, and because Palestinian resistance is not giving up to the Israeli occupation, to the apartheid regime, then the customers of Israeli weapons are going to be disappointed and lose interest in those weapons. And so I predicted a long-term decline in the Israeli arms exports. And if you just look at the time between 2009 and 2021, so 12 years, my theory seemed very sound. I was very convinced that my theory is correct. And that, yes, the customers are seeing that the Israeli weapons of oppression are simply not effective. They cannot solve political problems. There's no point in spending so much money to buy weapons, surveillance mechanisms, and so on, and even spyware, if in the end, the political situation remains very difficult or the resistance groups, the democratic movements in those countries are not giving up and continue to fight for their freedom, and as do the Palestinians in Palestine. So, but on the other hand, there was a spike in Israeli exports of weapons, which kind of contradicted my theory already in the war of Nagorno-Karabakh, where Azerbaijan attacked Nagorno-Karabakh twice. There were two wars, and using a lot of Israeli weapons. And because Israel was supplying those wars, it seemed like yes, the Israeli exports are increasing very much. So the theory that there is a long-term decline is not working. Also, at least in the first Nagorno-Karabakh war, it didn't look like a completely asymmetrical conflict, because it was between two sovereign states, Armenia and Azerbaijan, and not between one state and a civilian group. But in the second round, yes, it looks much more like an asymmetrical conflict, where the Israeli weapons are more appropriate, I should say, for asymmetrical conflict than for conventional war. But even then, I still believed that the reason for this has to do with corruption within the Israeli government, that in fact the Israeli government gave a major discount to Azerbaijan to buy those weapons, because they were bought from an Israeli company called IAI, which is all the workers in that company are members of a union, and are all members, and all the union members are members of the Likud party, the ruling party. So Netanyahu wanted the union members to vote in the internal primaries of the Likud party according to his wishes. He got them a very good deal with Azerbaijan. They all got a lot of bonuses. So it seemed like just normal corruption, not a long-term trend in the Israeli arms exports. But now, after October 7th, which was an even bigger humiliation for the Israeli military industry, of course. I mean, we acknowledge the terrible human horror that happened. But nevertheless, we cannot ignore that from the very in the very cynical world of the military industry, there's also a professional element to this from their point of view, that they're saying, well, the surveillance equipment didn't work, and the weapons were not strong enough to prevent the attack of October 7th against Israel. And Palestinian fighters were able to go very deep into Israeli territory, cause a lot of damage, cause a lot of death. And now we have 60 days of Israeli relentless bombardment, invasion, the use of all of these weapons, which is not bringing any kind of strategic results. I mean, it causes tremendous human suffering, unprecedented levels of killing and injuring of civilians. But in terms of military objectives, almost nothing. So I would expect, then again, according to my theory, that all of the countries that have contracts with Israel for weapons would say, no, that we're not going to buy your weapons because they're useless. And to my horror, I see the opposite. My expectations have been disproven. So I have to acknowledge this, that my research did not lead me to the right theory, because now the Israeli arms companies are reporting that their sales are increasing, and that governments are signing more deals to buy more weapons from Israel, even as these weapons are used by the Israeli military to commit acts of genocide. And I know this is a very controversial thing to say, and if you want in the discussion to ask why am I using the word genocide, I can of course explain. But this is something that I haven't seen Denmark sign a new contract. I want to say something about Denmark, but I have seen Sweden during the fighting signing a new contract to buy more weapons from Israel. So your neighbor. And other companies, and Elbit Systems, the biggest arms companies in Israel, are saying, we have so many orders, so much interest in our products that our factories are working around the clock, 24 hours a day, and we have to bring in workers that have already retired back to work in order to fulfill all the orders. So they're selling a lot of weapons, which means that somehow the perspective of the governments in countries that are buying these weapons, they are seeing a different reality. I'm not sure what exactly they're expecting, or maybe it's a different reason altogether. For example, that they are actually looking to sell weapons to Israel, but Israel is insisting on reciprocal deals. That's another issue. Or it could also be a politically motivated act, to buy Israeli weapons as a way to finance the Israeli war machine because they want to support the Israeli atrocities against Palestinians. So these are, this puts me in a somewhat of uncomfortable position of being a scholar, speaking to you about my failure to research properly, but I think in the name of honesty, I have to share this. But I do want to also say something about a very recent development, which I didn't know of when this event was organized. So I hope that Leandros and Amira, you're okay for me for responding to very, very recent events. There's a very important article in 972 magazine, which is called The Assassination Factory. This is an investigative piece by an Israeli journalist called Yuval Avraham. I very much recommend reading it, and also it was covered by Al Jazeera and by The Guardian and in other places, because apparently the Israeli military is using artificial intelligence in order to acquire targets. The language of acquiring targets is a very whitewashing kind of language. We have to understand this means designating people to be killed. Yeah, when we say target, we are talking about human beings. And what the Israeli officer is saying is that they have requirements, criteria, how many innocent civilians is it okay to kill in order to kill one person who they do want, like a Hamas fighter. Thanks, Leandros, for sharing the link. But then, of course, they have to collect intelligence at a very fast pace, because they need to know if there is a person that they suspect could be a Hamas fighter, they want to kill him, and they need to know how many people are around him to make the decision. Yes, it's all right to kill 3 children and 2 adults who are uninvolved or civilians in order to kill that person. And this ratio of one target, one so-called legitimate target, plus 5 civilians, they call it a legitimation factor of 5. And now they're talking about legitimation factors much, much higher, reaching up to 100. But still, the collection of intelligence is a limiting factor. It's like a bottleneck. And this happened in 2014 when Israel bombed and invaded Gaza, Operation Protective Edge, some of you may remember, in the summer of 2014, where it lasted for 51 days. And very quickly, the Israeli military ran out of targets, meaning that they have a list of places to bomb, and they have to make some kind of justification. Why do they bomb this particular building? And they need a dossier, a file that will say there is a suspicion that in this building there would be somebody, and then also a certain number of uninvolved civilians, innocent civilians, and we make the decision, yes to bomb, not to bomb. And collecting this information takes time, and it takes more time to collect the information than actually to fire the weapons, because just throwing the bomb is very fast. And now we have in this invasion of Gaza and bombing of Gaza, for the first time in history, a moment in which there are more targets than the rate in which the bombs are dropped. So the intelligence is no longer the bottleneck. And this is exactly what the article has exposed, that they're using artificial intelligence for this. That they're using artificial intelligence to create intelligence. First of all, I should say, this is the first time in history that we have a war being fought by artificial intelligence. And this is a topic that has appeared so much in science fiction, from the movie Terminator, which I think is maybe the most famous use of the idea of what would happen if artificial intelligence would have access to weapons, and will there be war between artificial intelligence and humans? And in our imagination as humans, we always think about the danger of artificial intelligence getting out of control and starting to use weapons against humans, to kill the humans, to take over the world, and then the artificial intelligence is stronger than people and more accurate and more deadly. So it's a post-apocalyptic scenario. Now we have it in real life. Now, and it doesn't look like in the science fiction movies. There is a difference, because the artificial intelligence continues to follow sort of the instructions that people give it. And in this case, the instructions were, we want to be able to kill more people. And we want the intelligence that will make it possible for us to have enough targets. So said the Israeli officers to the artificial intelligence. And the artificial intelligence has recruited the most powerful weapon it could find for that, which is the humans themselves. So it's not the artificial intelligence using weapons against humans, but artificial intelligence using humans against their targets, which are Palestinians, also humans. But then the actual bombs are dropped by people, not by the artificial intelligence. What you have here is a mechanism where the artificial intelligence does a survey of the locations which are to be bombed by using drone footage, cameras, and so on. And there's so much footage that no human being has enough time to look through all of it. And they use software for facial recognition to try to identify specific individuals. And then the soldiers are told, you're going to get a target, you're going to get the pictures that justify why this target should be bombed, like the conclusion of the artificial intelligence. You have to decide if this is okay or not, and then you pull the trigger if you think it's okay. But the soldiers don't really have time. And they almost automatically, as a very human response, they trust the machine. And they start to just pull the trigger without really looking very carefully, because they want to keep up with the rate of the machine. And in this way, the machine can actually select the places that the humans are going to bomb and destroy, and the people that they're going to kill. This is how artificial intelligence really works. And this is really something that we haven't seen before. And I should say that the way that artificial intelligence is doing this is by using this facial recognition software in two different ways at the same time. In one hand, it uses this facial recognition in order to tell the soldier, we believe that this person there in the picture is a known Hamas fighter, therefore it's okay for you to kill that person. And the soldier is supposed to verify this, but we doubt that they do verify it. But there's another thing that the artificial intelligence is saying, because there are more than 160 hostages that are still held in the Gaza Strip, Israeli hostages. And the soldiers don't want to hit them. So again, the artificial intelligence says, we have scanned the area and we don't find any hostages, so it's safe to bomb. And this can also be wrong. We don't know, but it doesn't matter, because if the artificial intelligence is accurate or not accurate, it doesn't matter if the artificial intelligence is really capable of doing what it promises. It's only enough that the soldier believes that it can do it. And if the soldier believes that the artificial intelligence has this ability, then the soldier will trust the machine and pull the trigger. And this is what we are seeing now. I want to say one last thing. I'm sorry, I've taken a little bit more time than I wanted, but I already see that plenty of questions are gathering up, because I want to say something about Denmark. When the war in Ukraine started, the Danish government made the decision to donate its entire artillery to Ukraine. And I'm not going to comment about that decision, not really our topic for today. But then it immediately said, oh, we're going to need new artillery. Which I would, in this point, I do want to comment, and why does Denmark need artillery? But let's say that they do. But they decided to buy their artillery, their entire artillery, from one company, the Israeli company Elbit Systems, which I've mentioned already a few times today. And this Elbit Systems is producing something called Atmos, which is an acronym for artillery truck mounted something, which is firing the 155 millimeter artillery shells. The Elbit Systems does not have the capacity to make enough of those artillery shells to bomb Gaza, because they've already fired more than 500 tons of those shells on Gaza, and they ran out of shells. So they're getting more of this artillery from the United States and from Germany. But Denmark is now expecting to also buy a lot of those shells for their artillery that they buy from Elbit Systems. They have very strong evidence of how this artillery works in a prohibited way, because according to international law, it's forbidden to use artillery in a residential area. And nevertheless, that's what. So that's a very big difference between the situation in Ukraine and the situation in Israel and Gaza. There was a corruption scandal in Denmark about this, because apparently when people started to protest about this, about the Danish government buying all of the artillery from just one company and paying a lot of money for it, and that this company is involved in serious war crimes and other violations of international law, the Danish Minister of Defense argued that Elbit Systems, that Denmark already made a promise to Elbit Systems, and if they now cancel the deal, then Elbit Systems will sue them, and they want to avoid a lawsuit. Later, it turned out that this was a lie, and in the end, they fired somebody from the Ministry of Defense, but not the minister, not the prime minister, and the deal was not canceled. So I think this is something that we need to be aware of, that Denmark is playing a very problematic role in being complicit in the crimes committed by the Israeli war machine by financing Elbit Systems, which is a very, very criminal company. I haven't even given you half of the list of the reasons why Elbit Systems is a criminal company. I can talk for more than an hour just about this topic. So, but I just wanted to say this, and now let's get to the questions and open the debate a bit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shir. Thank you so much. Yes, it's hard to upload when we are online. So Leandros will follow up with some questions. So Leandros is assistant professor in international studies in Aalborg University. He's also a member of the Democracy, Migration, and Society group. Leandros.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shir. And I really personally appreciate that despite those hard times, you were able to come and speak to us. I must say that this is the second time that I invite Shir in a academic setting. I had the honor of having him speak to my students when I taught my first class in the University of Marburg some years ago. I'm going to try to, first of all, I hope that you can hear me uninterrupted, because internet here, not so good. But I'm going to try to keep it short because I know that there are questions from the audience. And I would like to maybe for the first question do kind of a bridge to the politics and the geopolitics. And I think one of the relatively baffling things about this well, massacre, I wouldn't even call it a war, is the unconditional support that the United States is providing to Israel, diplomatically, but also militarily. I have to say that my hometown in Cyprus, Limassol, is very close to a Royal Air Force base, which has turned out to be the main staging post for resupplying Israel with shells, both from the US, the UK, and potentially other countries as well. So my question is, from your perspective, as somebody who is very intimately familiar with the Israeli military-industrial complex and with the close entanglement between the US and Israeli war machines, what role do you see this special military relationship playing on the unconditional support that Israel is receiving? Because when we look at it from a global perspective, conflicts like Ukraine, potential conflicts in Asia, supposedly, the US is trying to rally the global South, in a global so-called battle against authoritarianism. But this unconditional support for Israel, which is not, it even seems like the Americans actually want to pull the trigger themselves. In your opinion, how can we explain that? And what role do military relations play in this regard? I know it's a very broad question, and I know we can discuss a long time about it, but I would appreciate your comments on this as somebody who is, very much familiar with the political economy, not just of the arms industry, but also the Israeli economy itself.
So there's a scholar of the military industry from South Africa, where you are, Leandros, right now, and his name is Andrew Feinstein, and he wrote a book called The Shadow World, with a whole chapter about this, trying to answer the question that you just posed. And the name of the chapter is the America's Showcase, saying that Israel is in fact the shopping window for the US military industry, because the US provides so many weapons to Israel, and then Israel is using those weapons, and the world sees how those weapons work, and then buy them from Israel. And in fact, Henry Kissinger, who just passed away, had a very famous quote where he said, "For every tank that we give to Israel for free, the neighbors of Israel buy 4 tanks from the United States." So this is a long-term relationship, because in fact, the military financing started 50 years ago in 1 month. Yeah, in October 1973, and 1.5 months, if you want. So for those 50 years, this is the relationship that has developed. But let's look a little bit more recently. More recently, we see that the hegemony of the United States has been challenged very much. First, the war in Ukraine, which created a lot of pressure on NATO on the one hand, and started to isolate some of the allies of NATO and build a kind of counter coalition, not exactly an East Bloc, but something new that is developing. And when China mediated a peace treaty between Saudi Arabia and Iran earlier this year, this was a game changer for a lot of, a lot of scholars said this is now changing the whole power balance in the Middle East, and Israel is no longer able to become sort of the fortress of US imperial power in the Middle East anymore. The whole balance of power will change. And I'm listening a lot to Israeli media right now, a lot of generals who are speaking on the media in Hebrew, and the Israeli military censorship is not working right now, because also they're in shock and the state institutions are not working well. So I'm hearing from these generals things that normally would be military secrets, but now they're out in the open. And what they're saying, that in fact the United States has developed a plan which was in order to prevent the EU from buying gas and oil from Russia, to have an alternative pipeline that will go from Qatar through Saudi Arabia to Israel and then to Europe. And there are a lot of legal problems, a lot of technical problems, but most important is the political problem that Saudi Arabia and Israel are not friends and will not and cannot have this pipeline. But there was a lot of effort by the Biden administration to have normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia in order to make that pipeline possible, as a way for NATO to establish its hegemony, to win the war in Ukraine, to destroy the Russian military power. On October 7th, as the hours of the attack from Gaza were still going on, I've already started to hear Israeli generals saying, oh, now the whole pipeline is ruined. We'll never have normalization with Saudi Arabia. The whole plan is in shambles. But it looks like, and in their analysis, that the Biden administration has tried nevertheless to save the pipeline, to save the normalization by intervening and sending 3 aircraft carriers and 1 nuclear submarine to the Middle East, and fighting on the side of Israel, basically, and giving so much weapons to the Israeli military with some kind of delusional thought that military power can solve a political problem, and that somehow Israel will be able to do what the US itself has failed to do in Vietnam, and in Korea, and in Afghanistan, and in every other kind of asymmetrical conflict in which they thought that they could use military power to change the political structure of a country, and in fact, and in the end, the result is always the opposite. In the end, South Vietnam does not exist anymore. Afghanistan is now in the hands of the Taliban, and but nevertheless, it looks like Biden just continues the same mistakes of his predecessors. And even though it seems that he might lose the elections in the United States because of this, and there's a real possibility that Trump will become the president again because of this, Biden is still not willing to support a ceasefire.
Thank you very much. I will try to be as fast as possible. I have actually more questions, but I'm just going to say focus on 2. You described the basic outlines from the 972 investigative report that has come out now. I'm more or less asking for, what do you think is the insider perspective of the Israeli military leadership? Because in the way it is described, you have, let's say, a system, an algorithmic system that is supposedly geared to destroying Hamas. Now, if I was in the Israeli security establishment, I would probably remember what happened in 1982 when, Israel invaded Lebanon, trying to destroy the PLO, and ended up creating the conditions where a more disciplined and more organized military force, namely Hezbollah, emerged. So, is all this kind of euphemism of AI and trying to kill Hamas some kind of I would say more controversially, some kind of moral justification for just killing many Palestinians? Because it's obvious that the whole history of guerrilla warfare and counterinsurgency teaches that you cannot really destroy political forces embedded within civilian populations and within circumstances that encourage armed struggle. You might win militarily, but you cannot win politically. So what's actually going on, in your opinion, in the minds of the Israeli leadership? Because when I see it at first glance, this whole kind of selection of targets and the AI and trying to locate Hamas, it just appears as some kind of euphemism for mass murder.
Leandros, your question implies rationality. There is no rationality in situations like this. This is not how it works. In fact, the Israeli government doesn't really function anymore as a government. Every minister has their own little kingdom and they do whatever they want. And the Minister of National Security, Tamar Ben-Gvir, is now building his own army. So in addition to the army that already exists. So you have a situation which is teetering on the precipice of anarchy. I agree that the reason that AI plays an important role here is because it is used as justification for mass killing. Yes, it doesn't mean that the AI itself is nothing. It's not just a euphemism. There is something there. There is a computational power. But if I have to go and look for the logic, if you have a deep interview now with a military, with an intelligence officer in Israel, and you pose the same question to him, and to say and ask him why is isn't AI just euphemism, and are you just not trying to kill people? Then he would say there is a theory of Yitzhak Ben Israel, who is an Israeli general and university professor at the same time, who developed a kind of mathematical theory, how many people from an organization you have to kill before the organization collapses. And a lot of Israeli generals read this article, and they believe that if they are just able to kill enough Hamas fighters, Hamas will stop working. This is, of course, wrong, but that's how they think. And so the problem is then a legal and a political problem. How can you kill this number of people without losing international support and without falling under a military embargo and without basically losing the legitimacy of the state of Israel? And then the question is, how many civilians can you actually kill for this? One of the questions that I saw here was the question about what is the calculation, and is there a ceiling for that calculation? So the calculation is really based on a very cynical analysis. How many can we get away with? And then the AI is supposed to give you an easy answer to this, because it's a moral dilemma. And if you put a human being making those decisions, this human being might actually get cold feet and say, I don't feel like killing children today. I don't want to do this, and to drop a bomb. I mean, Israeli soldiers are still human beings. And even if they are capable of these terrible atrocities, maybe not all of them are capable. And it's enough that one of them will say, this is too much for me, that it will cause a scandal, and the system will not work as efficiently as a factory. So that's why AI is important, because it allows this machine to work, and then the human factor is reduced to just pulling the trigger.
Thank you, Shir. I think due to limited time, I will suggest that we pass directly to the other questions, and if there's time, I will ask my final question later. But thank you very much for your responses. I think this has been quite illuminating. You know, we have to study, I think, all these mechanisms of power. No matter how sick to our stomachs we are every day by what we are seeing, but I think this is also the role of critical engaged scholarship in the end. So I will, I don't know, is Sophie coordinating the discussion? So I would maybe pass on to her or Amira.
I think we will first take the questions on the room. If you want, just raise your hand. We have one question from Frida. Maybe we can have 3 questions from the room and then 3 questions from the chat. Frida. Frida?
Oh, sorry about that. I actually just wrote the question to Sophie, but well, since I have it all written down, then I can just read it out. First of all, thank you so much for everything that you've said, and for the brilliant presentation. It's actually quite shocking to hear about all these things, such as the relationship, the kind of symbiotic relationship between the US and Israel, and how they handle the sort of the economical race of arms, and so they wouldn't develop so much. But to get to the question, I want to ask a little bit more about the future of Israeli arms dealing. I know you already touched down on the fact that because of the way that this invasion has been handled, and what we would call the failures of the Israeli defense to block the attacks from Hamas, it will of course lead to certain levels of mistrust to the Israeli weapon system. But what I wanted to ask more, or talk a little bit more about, is the trust, because Amira held a movie session where we watched a documentary made in 2013, made by an Israeli journalist, where we learned through it that Israel makes a lot of money in arms dealing, and it is a big part of the Israeli economy. So that is something that some of us were taught in this documentary. So Shir, I would hear you. Yeah, the lab. Shir, I would like to hear your thoughts that as the aftermath of the invasion, how severely will this affect the sales of Israeli arms? And therefore, how much will it overall affect the Israeli economy as a whole? And then furthermore, do you, Shir, think that the US will then continue to send Israeli arms support for free, even if the Israelis' weapon developing isn't perhaps going to be as fast-paced or as advanced with the receding funding as it is before?
Thanks. Two more questions, and then I'll...
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Sunil, if you want to ask your question.
Thank you very much, Amira. Thank you. This was absolutely fascinating. I learned so much today. I just want to connect two points. One is a question I put in the chat, which was to do with the failure of surveillance just before October 7th and on October 7th, given that Israel is a leader in surveillance. And secondly, the point that you made about the futility of a military solution to a political problem. And I was wondering if those two were connected in any way. In other words, looking at the military-industrial complex in the United States, looking at how perhaps the US is getting rid of, old ammunition and weapons to be replaced through the Ukrainian war, and how. So, for example, if October 7th hadn't taken place, what would have been the whole the political economy of the arms industry? So I'm just thinking whether this was, I know it goes down the road of a conspiracy theory, but whether there is a kind of a need to justify the kind of interventions that we are seeing. Because I just can't understand how otherwise one can explain the collective punishment that's being meted out to the Palestinians.
Thank you, Sunil. Sebastian?
Hi, okay, there we go. Yes, first off, thank you for holding this presentation. It's been very, very informative. You mentioned briefly how the deal brokered between Saudi Arabia and Iran by China changed the sort of power dynamics in the region. And I'm assuming this was based off the idea that the US was trying to sort of negotiate could we call it a united front against Iran by brokering a deal of normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Could you, I suppose, do you have anything to add, or could you elaborate further on how this power dynamic might develop with this change, given that, as far as I understand it, China also has deep economic ties to both Saudi Arabia and Iran, which might allow it to better sort of negotiate the longevity of this sort of peace agreement between these two powers, making it more difficult for the US and Israel to sort of, should we say, front Saudi Arabia against Iran? Thank you.
Thank you. And I made also the note of the questions in the chat, so I could just go directly to answering all of the questions as fast as I can. Okay, I'll start. The movie The Lab is very recommended, and I'm glad to hear that, Amira, you showed it to people who participate here, because I think it's a very important movie. I do not agree that the Israeli military industry is so important to the Israeli economy that the profits that it makes cover the cost of occupation and apartheid. That's an important point, because the movie really focuses on the income. It doesn't focus on the cost of what it costs Israel to maintain this regime of injustice. And this is something that, because remember, these arms companies, their biggest customer is the Israeli government. Before they sell to the rest of the world, they sell to the Israeli government. And if the Israeli government has to use taxpayer money to arm, become a kind of fortress state, a very militaristic state with so much weapons, so much ammunition, then this is a burden on the economy. And now, with the current invasion of Gaza, the current genocide that we are experiencing, of course, it's very difficult to look at the Israeli economy because the horrors of what's happening in Gaza just dwarf everything. But we have to do real scholarship. So the Israeli economy has not functioned since October 7. The financial system is in shambles. Public services don't work. There are about 250,000 people who are internally displaced because they are afraid to go back to their homes close to Gaza or close to Lebanon. And there are about 250,000 Israelis who left the country. Now there are about another 250,000, a bit more than 250,000, who are reservist soldiers who have left their jobs and are in Gaza right now or around Gaza. So this means that the Israeli economy is not functioning. And the ministry, the chairman of the Israeli Central Bank says that he estimates the war is going to cost $50 billion, which is about 10% of the Israeli GDP. That is an incomprehensible amount. There is no way the Israeli government is able to pay this or cover those costs. The Israeli public would be able to bear these costs. There's no amount of tax increase or debt increase that will make that possible. And there's also no chance that the United States is going to cover it, because the United States has its own financial crisis, and $50 billion is just more than they've ever given to Israel in the past, far more. So there is no future for this economy. And I think that is also something that we need to think about. If we think about were there elements within Israel who wanted some kind of provocation to happen, if they had access to intelligence about October 7 and decided not to operate on it because they wanted justification for genocide in Gaza? I strongly disagree with those theories. I think there is no evidence for them. And I think that the fact that if we listen to what Israelis are saying now, they're saying it in Hebrew, so you have to speak Hebrew in order to hear those words, but you hear it from all parts of society where people are saying the state of Israel has already stopped functioning. There is no state. There is people lost their trust in the state institutions. The military is out of control and breaking apart into smaller elements. So in that sense, also the future of the US military financing of Israel is in jeopardy, because the US is not interested in helping the Israeli military out of the kindness of their heart or out of Zionist ideology. They're doing it out of very cynical utility considerations. And there are other forces within the Middle East who are becoming better prospects for the United States to project US imperial power in the region, like United Arab Emirates. And I think the United Arab Emirates, I mean, when I say better, I mean from a very cynical point of view. I don't think the United Arab Emirates is a particularly nice country. But from the point of view of the United States, the United Arab Emirates are a good candidate because they have increased their imports of US weapons to exceed Israel. The UAE is buying more weapons from the United States than Israel. So obviously the Pentagon is now looking at them more favorably. Now, the military-industrial complex is the term that you used, Sunil, is a term that I've often objected to use in the context of Israel, because I said, well, this is an industry that is very state-owned. And in the United States, when it's private companies that are built for profit, and the famous speech by Eisenhower explaining how the profit interest of those companies is what drives war, and he coined the term military-industrial complex, for those of you who don't know, then it's not a good description of the situation in Israel. But I think this has changed because of the privatization. And now the Israeli arms industry does look like a military-industrial complex. And yes, they are profiting from war. And maybe this is a moment to connect to one of the questions that were in the chat. How do I then explain that when these weapons prove themselves to be failing, still countries are buying more and more of them? If my theory doesn't work, then what's the alternative explanation? And At the moment, I mean, I don't have all the answers, but sort of my working alternative, my working hypothesis is that when Israel has been saying that its connection to the West has been a connection based on shared values, I've always dismissed that as mere propaganda and that there's nothing behind that. But perhaps there is, in fact, something behind that, that there are shared values of white supremacy, of colonialism, of apartheid that Western governments want to support. And then they're willing to buy useless weapons if they believe that they will nevertheless prop up this regime of apartheid in Israel. And that is based not on their economic or utilitarian decisions, but based on their ideology. That would be my answer. And then, of course, this is a counter explanation to the explanation of the military-industrial complex, because it's not exactly war profiteering, it's ideology. Yeah, and then your question was, what if there was no October 7th? I think that there are many different people who are asking this question from many different angles. I'm not completely sure. Would Israel still embark on a genocidal campaign in Gaza? Probably not, because they do need this justification. They need the ability to silence the internal critical voices. I said in the beginning, this journalist Israel Frey, who had to escape from his home, one example out of thousands of Israelis who had to escape, basically because calling for peace is considered to be treason. That this is only possible in a moment of emergency. Nevertheless, I don't think that there was anyone on the Israeli side who intentionally allowed October 7th to happen. I think that this is a way of people to develop those theories, I would say conspiracy theories, as if there was somebody in Israel who had the intelligence and decided not to act on it, which is based on colonial way of thinking, as if Palestinians are somehow stupid and primitive and not able to surprise the Israeli military, as if they are inferior in some way. So the only explanation for their effective attack is that the Israelis betrayed, somebody on the Israeli side betrayed. And I don't accept that. I think that Hamas are very effective in their ability to plan strategy and to attack and to kill, and they knew exactly what they were doing. But the Israelis, being trapped in their colonial way of thinking and traditions, they certainly underestimated Hamas. They certainly underestimated Palestinians in general, and they continue to underestimate them when they believe that sending more tanks and more artillery and more bombs is going to change something politically. Right. So I think the last question that was from the audience posed verbally was about the Iran, Saudi Arabia, China, and this is a very complex topic. And I do agree with this analysis that it is about the US attempt to build an anti-Iran alliance, where Israel plays a very important role in providing the military technology, but Saudi Arabia, the UAE, play a very important role as well in providing money and thereby building this sort of world order that the US wants to see in the Middle East, and that has completely fallen apart. So this is indeed something that changes the power structure. And I think it's also very interesting to see that when that happened, it also was exposed to the level of internal problems with the Israeli intelligence system. And already there it was revealed that the Israeli intelligence had no idea that China is mediating this deal and that this deal is upcoming. And let's say, prestige or the reputation of the Israeli Mossad and other intelligence organizations was already challenged, but there was no reflection and no attempt to repair it. And then October 7 proved that this intelligence system is really corrupt to the core. rotten to the core. Okay, so going now to the questions from the chat, I already addressed the one about the failure of my own theory, and there were two people who asked about the literature, the names of the authors and so on. So I think we can find a way to share it. Maybe Amira, you can tell me
exactly.
in what way. Yeah, but I'll gladly, of course, share links, names of authors and so on. And I can also share my email address if you want to send me specific questions for your own research that you're working on and you need something that I didn't mention specifically in the talk, then I'll gladly share it with you on a personal level as well. And finally, no, not finally, there were two things. One was about the proportion of, I did address a little bit what is the calculation of how many civilians is okay to kill for one so-called legitimate target or Hamas fighter, and how this limit is ratio is calculated from a rational, very cynical point of view. When is the moment in which international support collapses? And of course, this is an Israeli calculation, which has nothing to do with reality, because the reality is, of course, that the world is already in complete uproar about the Israeli genocide in Gaza, and it's only in a very small part of the world, which is the North America and the European Union, which we don't know about it, but or we don't hear about it. But the majority of the world is not the European Union and North America. But there was also a question about the proportion of the Palestinian population. I don't want to be dragged into turning Palestinians into numbers, like Amir said in the beginning. We often do that, and that is also a form of dehumanization. But I think it does help us a little bit to understand that if 1 out of every 200 Palestinians in Gaza has already been killed, and in addition to that, many more have been injured, and many more are missing, and there are many who are buried under the rubble, and we don't know if they're killed or maybe if nobody will rescue them, then they will die. Then just imagine for yourself what it means if 1 in every 200 people you know would be killed. And I think that it's a really horrible thought. It's a lot. But when I say the word genocide, it's not about numbers. Again, the genocide is about intention. It's about a systematic process of dehumanizing people and then cutting them off from basic necessities and then killing them in large numbers. But it doesn't have to be a proportion of the population which is high or low. Yeah. So from the point of view of the Israeli military, they say that they're trying to follow international law in this attack by using the proportion of what is the purpose of the attack as to how much collateral damage, how many uninvolved civilians are killed. And so, but then they fail to say what is the purpose of the attack, because the government is not clear. Is the purpose of the attack destroying Hamas? Is the purpose of the attack bringing back the hostages? If you look at the soldiers, you see that many of them have shirts which say, let's have a party on the beach of Gaza on October 7, 2024. So the purpose of the attack from their point of view is to conquer Gaza, kill everybody, take over the territory. So again, it's not about the numbers or but it's about what is the purpose of those calculations. The last question that I have here is about the media. In what way does the media support the Israeli military industry? There are, in fact, ways in which the Israeli technologies is hyped by the media. And I see this a lot in the German media. I don't know about the Danish media, that Israeli weapons are presented as very effective and high-tech weapons just because they are Israeli, not because of any other reason. And this is indeed contributing to the hype, and the hype contributes to arms sales, and the arms sales contribute to killing. So the media does have a responsibility, of course, not to do this. The media also has a responsibility to report on the dark side of high-tech stories. For example, when you have Israeli companies that are providing technologies that don't seem to have to do with the military, but the media fails to mention the fact that these same companies also has a military division, or that the board members are officers who are guilty of war crimes, and there are these connections that there is a journalistic responsibility for them to report. But I'll just share one example, because this one has really struck me. Just from 2 days ago, an article by the Wall Street Journal, so American media, which mentioned that the US is giving Israel bunker-busting bombs. Bunker-busting bombs, which are supposed to be able to penetrate into the tunnels. These are very targeted bombs, very smart bombs, and are supposed to be able to kill, let's say, Hamas officers in a way that minimizes the death. And that's how the Wall Street Journal presented it. But if you read the article very closely, you see that those bunker-busting bombs, which weigh each one of them 2,000 pounds, one metric ton, and the US is providing Israel with 100 of those bombs, and also with 5,400, I repeat, 5,400 bombs, which also weigh 2,000 pounds, 1 ton bombs, but are not smart bombs and are not bunker busting and explode in a large radius and destroy entire residential buildings. So in what way can you give a title to a newspaper article to say the US is helping Israel reduce collateral damage by giving them smart bombs, when in fact the US has given 100 smart bombs and 5,400 dumb bombs, and more weapons in addition to that, but that's just to highlight this example of this article from Wall Street Journal. And I do want to say that if you do encounter articles in this tone in the Danish media, it will actually help me very much if you share them with me, because I can work with Danish activists to highlight this bias reporting.
Yeah, thank you, Shir. I will just suggest, if we have more questions, to extend the time of the meeting, if this is okay with you, Shir, and for those who can stay.
I have a little bit of time, because I'm actually supposed to meet with the UN group of arms control in a few minutes, like in half an hour, to talk about the military embargo against Israel, and I think it's a very important meeting. But yeah, I can stay for a few more minutes here.
Okay, great. Yes. Please, those who have questions, yeah. Ruda? I don't know how to pronounce. And Carlos.
Okay, that was me, I guess. I'm Rick. Yeah, so just to follow up on what I was asking in the chat, I have serious doubts about the extent to which this AI is actually serving its kind of ostensible purpose as a decision system, because it's only a decision system if there are binding constraints that are produced, which I have serious doubts about, because if the ratios of collateral damage to targets are such that if the product of collateral damage times targets is equal to or greater than the population of Gaza, this is not a decision mechanism. It is simply a legitimation for genocide. And yeah, that's why I'm asking, is there any real good reason to believe that the system is producing any binding constraints? In other words, numbers that would say, okay, don't do it, don't hit this person because the collateral damage is too large, which I very seriously doubt.
Maybe I'll just very quickly answer, because of course I don't know exactly how this algorithm works, but I do think that it's very similar to the way that the algorithm of the language models of AI work. And the language models, the machine learning process is that the algorithm tries to anticipate when the answer that it will give will be acceptable by the user. And the user will find that useful, and therefore will give more answers like this. So there is a certain ratio between targets that are accepted and targets that are stopped, but it's not based on a mechanism, like you say, it's not based on a mechanism of really harming innocent civilians, or really confirmation that killing Hamas fighters, but rather on what is the right ratio between allowing and preventing the attacks that is most likely to get the operator to believe that the AI is reliable. So that's how the language model works. It doesn't work on the world, it works on the user. So of course, from a legal point of view, that is extremely problematic. And from a moral and ethical point of view, extremely problematic. I think that point is clear. But does that mean that the AI will allow all of the attacks? No, because then maybe the user will stop trusting it.
But the user is the soldier, right? So it would, to get a negative feedback, it would require a soldier to refuse a command to kill. And when does that happen?
Well, for example, if the AI would say there is a 10% chance that you will hit an Israeli hostage, and the soldier says, well, for 10%, I don't want to pull the trigger.
Yeah. Carlos?
Thank you, Amira. Sorry for my voice. I'm with a terrible allergy. So my question is related to the role of Israeli universities in all of this. And I think that as academics, this should be one of our main concerns of all of us. And I will develop just a bit more. So I was reading recently the Economy of the Occupation, a socioeconomic bulletin. This is from 2009, so it's not recent, 14 years. And it has a list of all Israeli universities and the connections they have with the military, the Israel military. And for instance, if I check just an example, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, the one, at least in 2009, the chairman of the board of Elbit Systems is also a member of the Hebrew University Board of Governments. We see this also in Europe, where academics from Israeli universities are editors-in-chief of some of the main journals in my field, management and organization studies. This is my field. And also members of the executive board of some of the main academic organizations responsible for knowledge production in my field. So what I mean is, so my question is, what's the role of all of this? How can we question, interrogate this? And to which extent are we allowed to do it when there is the power to silence us in many ways? Thank you.
And I want to add to this is also university have a direct link to the militaries, like not only as individual being, but also direct relationship and collaboration with the military here in Europe and other.
Oh yeah, many UK universities also.
Thank you, Carlos. I'm very glad to see that the report authored by my colleague Uri is still being used today, so many years after. But of course, we need to do a lot of updates for this. I agree. But yeah, universities in Israel are very deeply complicit with the military industry. They develop weapons. They discriminate against Palestinian students. There is now, during the current genocide, the University of Netanya simply expelled all of the Palestinian students. I'm talking about Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. They are citizens of Israel. From the dorms, they just allowed only Jews to stay in the dorms and kicked out all of the Palestinians in the city of Netanya. But what you say about the board members, we have to be a little bit more careful about that, because it's not the same. If a Danish general or a Danish member of an armed company is also on the board of a university, or if an Israeli one, and it's not because if it's an Israeli or a Danish person, but it's about their personal culpability in committing war crimes. So I would also say, yes, if there is a war criminal from any country in the world which commits war crimes, I mean, Denmark is not involved in any current wars as far as I know, but there are, but let's say you will have somebody coming from Myanmar, and to be a member of the board of a university in Denmark, I would say this is of course not legitimate and has to be prevented. And when we're talking about the Israeli universities, if you have board members who have personally overseen the killing of civilians and committed war crimes, that is much more important than if they are filling the role of a board member in a company that is called an arms company, because it's not just an arms company, it's an arms company that is participating in genocide.
So what should we do? What is our role? How should we act as academics?
We need to support the academic boycott. And the academic boycott, there are very clear guidelines to this in the website of the BDS movement. And I'll just, I won't go into all of the guidelines, but I do urge you to follow the guidelines. The most important is that we do not boycott individuals, we boycott institutions, right? So there might be individuals who just happen to be from Israel, like myself, but boycotting people just because of where they were born and because they are Jewish is of course not acceptable in any way. But boycotting an institution which discriminates against Palestinians, which develops weapons that are used for genocide, the institutions have to be held responsible. And academia works through collaboration, through joint work, and this is where we draw the line. By the way, the Israeli universities are now reporting that the academic boycott is spreading very, very fast. And about 90% of all Israeli professors are saying, we feel it already. So many universities in the world are already taking action, and I hope that yours as well.
Sophie, do we have questions from the chat?
Yes, we do. I just wanted to raise my hand to represent that. Leila has written a question twice about, she'd like to know about the possible future for the situation and your thoughts on that.
Okay, I cannot predict the future, but it does seem to me that the chance that Israel will have a military victory is almost zero. And if there is no military victory, then what's going to happen? And I think there could be a military defeat. It's a bit hard to imagine, in the same way that it was hard to imagine that South Vietnam could lose on the battlefield with the support of the United States. But things like this do happen. A military defeat means, of course, a regional war. It means Lebanon, it means Yemen, it means Syria are all going to be drawn into this, and it's going to cost many more tens of thousands of human lives. So this is really a horrible scenario, which ends also with no more state of Israel. That would mean a military defeat. I think historical examples show that the European countries, let's say the hegemonic countries in the world, when this sort of scenario happens, they immediately forget the past and will go to Hamas and say, we remove you from the list of terror organizations, we want to have diplomatic relations with you. That's what always happens in these situations. I don't see that as a good scenario. There is also a scenario that the state of Israel will collapse without a war. And this is already happening as well. And then there is a good chance that there will be democracy. And right now, during the fighting, it sounds very difficult to believe that, because as you understand, people who support democracy are hiding, are afraid to speak out. But is this going to last for very long? I don't know. I think the only thing I can say with certainty is that the future is not going to look like the past. That this is a watershed moment, and history is taking a new direction.
I don't know if you have time for one last question from Sunil. Yes? Thank you so much.
You're muted, Sunil.
Very quickly, Shir, this might be very unfair, but what do you think Hamas expected following October 7th?
This is exactly what I said now.
And I'm also asking, sorry,
yeah.
I'm asking this question in terms of the geopolitical connections, perhaps, with Iran and so on and so forth. And also, given what I understood about Israeli creating Hamas in a sense to depose the PLO, and how that whole kind of thing gets very complex and very, very messy.
Yeah, okay. Israel did not create Hamas. That's another one of those theories that take away the agency of Palestinians. It is true that during the first Intifada in the 80s, or up to the first Intifada, when Israel saw Fatah as the main enemy because they were representing democratic and socialist ideas, they wanted an Islamic alternative, so they allowed the Islamic groups more freedom to organize themselves, but they didn't create Hamas. And yes, Iran is supporting Hamas with weapons and money, and that's part of the reason that Hamas has power. But they also have, of course, their local supporters and their own ingenuity and their own weapons that they build with their own hands. But what were they expecting? I think that this is the scenario that I said now, that they believed that Israel will lose the ability to make decisions and will act in a predictable way. And this is happened exactly so far, exactly like Hamas predicted it. Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas, was in Israeli prison for about 20 years. He speaks perfect Hebrew, and in his cell, he had the books of the most famous Israeli authors, Amos Oz, Aleph Bet Yehoshua, and he understands Israeli society very well. And he knew that Israel will lose control, will act out of revenge and not in a strategic way, will get trapped in a war in Gaza. And yes, I believe that he completely expected there would be a tremendous amount of Palestinian casualties, and this is also horrifying with what ease Hamas was willing to sacrifice Palestinian lives in order to achieve their goals, believing that this would lead to a third intifada, that also the West Bank will rise up, that Hezbollah will intervene from Lebanon, and that indeed it could lead to a multi-front war that the Israeli military will not be able to manage for very long. And if the state of Israel really collapses, which could happen, the moment, of course, the US says we're not willing to spend more time and money and blood and money for that conflict, and the moment that the US will say, okay, we're taking a step back, then there will be no more state of Israel, and then there will be a state of Palestine under Hamas. So you ask, what do they want? What do they expect? This is a scenario which is very realistic. I think we can prevent it. We can stop it by bringing in the moral arguments, the ethical arguments, the legal arguments, the issues of human rights. And a military embargo plays a very important role here, because a military embargo is what will get the Israelis to stop. We've seen this in 2014, the invasion of Gaza. I mentioned it was 51 days. Why was it 51 and not 52? I'm not sure if you're aware of this, that the Israeli military was bombing Gaza every day, and President Obama at the time decided it's too much. So he decided that one shipment of Hellfire missiles will be stopped. He gave an executive order stopping one shipment of Hellfire missiles, and the next day it was a ceasefire, because the Israelis understood that this is the end. They don't have enough ammunition to continue on their own. And so it's also something that we can do.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Shir. Thank you so much for all those who have been here. I think we should have more events like this and talk more. It feels like 2 hours. We cannot cover everything. Yeah, I think for now we should keep calling for ceasefire and to stop the genocide, and keep collaborating and organizing and boycotting. Yeah, thank you so much, and have a nice day. Bye.
Thank you very much, Shir.
Thank you. Goodbye.